This is Jacqueline Lukeman with the Real News Network. There's plenty of focus on the violent riots happening across the country. At least that's how they're being described by far too many people who are angry about the incidents of property damage that have occurred. Now, certainly it's jarring to see entire car lots charred, windows broken out of storefronts, and damage done to small businesses that were already struggling to survive amid the pandemic. These images could easily cause people to look at the protests as illegitimate or as harboring criminals, and that's certainly how people, at least many people, have responded to the incidents of property damage. But I think we need to put the issue of property damage in the proper historical perspective in relation to racial justice. Because regardless how angry people are about burned buildings in these current protests, there were times in history when property damage wasn't anyone's concern but ours. And the protection of property and property value has long been a key focus of white Americans in the struggle against racial justice. These historical roots to the connection of property rights, colonialism, and capitalism are very important factors in how protests that marginalized people conduct when there's property damage involved are perceived by the dominant society. Now, in a capitalist society, protecting property and its value is and will always be more important than protecting human life. This is very important to understand because the protection of property and property values from Black people in particular is a specific trope used in the language of white supremacy. Now, certainly, poor white people are seen by the system as lacking value too, but we also know that historically, poor white people have been able to be convinced by the landowning, wealthy white planter class that their designation as the descendants of colonists gave them an advantage over the descendants of the African colonists designated as slaves by judicial edict after having been on the same level as those European indentured servants in the colonies prior to 1641, when the freedoms that could be gained through completing a contract for indentured servitude was taken away from Africans in the colonies, and an advantage over the Africans brought here in chains after 1619, as well as over other immigrants arriving long after the colonies fought for their own independence from British rule. The promise of the ability to one day be a member of that landowning wealthy elite was enough to convince some white people that their allegiance was to that bourgeois class rather than with their class allies, landless and poor Africans and other immigrants. In fact, one of the so-called founding fathers, Samuel Adams, enshrined the ownership and protection of property into a very short list of colonists' rights when he said, quote, "Among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, a right to life; second, a right to liberty; and thirdly, to property, together with the right to defend them in the best manner they can." So the pursuit of property ownership as a means to social status was the carrot used to entice poor white colonists that protecting property was as important as protecting life and liberty, but only the property, liberty, and lives of those who were considered colonists, which enslaved Africans were not. Conversely, this rhetoric of protecting property was the basis for the nation's first legal racial covenant laws in real estate that were established by J. Barry Mahool, the mayor of Baltimore in 1910. Ironically, Mahool was considered sort of a progressive in his time. He was an advocate for women's suffrage, and he was supposed to be all about social justice, but his public zoning segregation law was implemented so that he said, quote, "Blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority. This is the stick of protecting the property value of white people that has been used against Black people ever since. And it is this segregation of public property in the North that gave rise to the nationwide practice of racial zoning, the precursor to redlining, and efforts to solidify the sacredness of property ownership and property value among white homeowners and white people. Just 12 years after the Mahul Law was implemented in Baltimore, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, the predecessor of the National Association of Realtors, published a training manual for its employees in which it stated that, quote, the purchase of property by certain racial types is very likely to diminish the value of other property. The training manual, published in the very next year, 1923, stated explicitly that Black families are a threat to property values and that foreigners were the most undesirable residents. Undoubtedly, some would argue that Black people don't value their property or take care of it like white people do, and even foreigners do, because most immigrants are not as reviled today as they were in the early 20th century. Well, at least if they're not Muslims, but that's another discussion. But with the segregation of neighborhoods came the simultaneous disinvestment of Black neighborhoods, using the same logic that was used to keep Black people from living in white neighborhoods, that the property values of areas where Black people lived was lower than that of where white people lived. But rather than this being true because of Black people's behavior, property values in Black enclaves were and are lower because of intentional disinvestment of public funds for municipal services that Black people pay taxes for just like white people do, but do not receive an equal share of. Property values of Black homeowners are routinely assessed lower than those of white homeowners in comparable neighborhoods to this day, even if those neighborhoods are so-called upper class. From racial discrimination in the appraisal of homes owned by Black people, to banks allowing vacant homes in Black neighborhoods to rot while taking better care of vacant homes in white neighborhoods, to disinvestment by businesses, which lowers the income base and tax base for Black residents, which leads to the inability for Black homeowners to draw on equity to restore and repair their homes. The mantra of protecting property that so many white people from outside of cities like Kenosha believe that they are honor-bound to adhere to is a part of a historic, vicious cycle that at its foundation was crafted on the racist idea that the very existence of certain people would devalue white people's property. And protecting property from Black people and our comrades in the case of these protests with violence is also not new. Throughout the history of marginalized people fighting to end racial housing discrimination, white homeowners and residents resisted change and integration with violence over and over again, very often going so far as to destroy the very property the undesirable family tried to move into in an effort to keep their neighborhood pure. How that destruction of property wasn't criminal and didn't reduce surrounding property values only makes sense in a system in which valuing property is literally more important than valuing people. In fact, Black people were so deeply devalued as human beings that property damage and looting committed in riots against our communities was allowed to happen repeatedly throughout history with no repercussions whatsoever. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, white communities across the country resisted the migrating free people from the former slave states settling in their communities with violence. From the mid-19th century, white-led race riots targeted Black residents and their homes and communities, destroyed or stole their property, murdered hundreds, if not thousands, and ran the rest out of countless towns, leaving many communities all white well into the late 20th century, and some to this day. The Polk County Massacre in 1896 was a response to Black workers migrating to Polk County, Arkansas, to work on the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf Railway. In their refusal to allow Black migration to the county, white mobs murdered 3 Black people and wounded 8. This type of labor-related racist violence was replicated across the entire state of Arkansas as Black people sought work but were repelled from working and living there with racist terrorism. In the Springfield Massacre of 1908, a mob of 5,000 white people shot and killed 6 Black people, lynched 2, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Black residents' property was destroyed. About 2,000 Black people were driven out of the city of Springfield, Illinois, as a result of the riot. The Springfield riot was a sort of prototype for similar acts of racial violence against Black people in Illinois and across the country, most of which were not recorded in great detail. The Slocum Massacre of 1910 saw a mob of 200 or 300 white men hunt down and shoot in the back Black residents of the small, unincorporated community of Slocum, Texas, where many residents owned their property and several were business owners. Fueled by a rumor of white grievance against a Black resident over a loan, the mob of white people shot Black residents where they found them, in their homes, in the streets as they were fleeing, and followed terrified people into the woods where they tried to flee the onslaught, murdering an untold number of people. Then a renewed wave of racist terrorism against Black people rose in the summer of 1919. When bloody attacks on Black people and communities were committed by white mobs across the country again. The impetus this time was Black soldiers coming back from World War I with the unconscionable idea that because they fought in a war for this country, they should be given equal rights in this country. The Ku Klux Klan posted notices in a Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, declaring, "The war is over, Negroes. Stay in your place. If you don't, we'll put you there." And they followed through with lots of help from white citizens and law enforcement. White mobs terrorized Black people in the largest riots in Charleston, South Carolina, Longview, Texas, Bisbee, Arizona, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Illinois, Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, and Elaine, Arkansas. In addition, white supremacists lynched nearly 100 Black people and initiated dozens of smaller racist clashes throughout the country. During what is known as the Red Summer of 1919, Black bodies were attacked, Black lives were taken, and an untold amount of Black property was damaged, looted, or destroyed. These white riots occurred in at least 26 cities across the country, destroying the hard-earned economic accomplishments of Black people in city after city, driving people from their homes into poverty and despair. One of the most well-known cases of white racist destruction of Black property was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where a mob of white people murdered 300 Black people, looted and then burned to the ground the entire 35 square blocks of the successful Black neighborhood of Greenwood, otherwise known as Black Wall Street, with the exception of the church. They left that standing, driving residents from their homes, leaving over 10,000 Black people homeless. The small community of Rosewood, Florida, was burned to the ground in 1923. Its Black residents driven into the woods after the Klan led a mob of white people on a rampage that killed 8 people, 6 Black and 2 white, and looted property and livestock of the former residents of the town. There has never been an accurate accounting of how many people were actually killed. The theft of Black farmland through violence or coercion has left a lasting impact on Southern Black families in particular, as the lingering effects of slavery, sharecropping, and Jim Crow in the South still keeps Black families who once had land in abject poverty in that region, as their farms were co-opted by white people who continue to profit off the Black gold under their feet that our ancestors worked, that they systematically stole. And that's just a small sampling of the direct and unorganized, if you want to call it, violence to Black people and property that doesn't even take into account the organized, premeditated, and legalized violence against Black communities that destroyed them, like what was done to Seneca Village in the 1850s, when the mostly Black and Irish community was seized by eminent domain by the city of New York. Over half the residents of Seneca Village owned their homes, but they were called squatters, and the settlement was called Nigger Village, as the community was raised to build what is now the most expensive piece of real estate in Manhattan, if not the country, Central Park. The sundown towns that legislated in their bylaws, constitutions, and through violence that Black people couldn't live in the town or even be in the town after the sun went down is a part of this legacy. The government's involvement in creating ghettos that concentrated disinvestment, decay, and decades of poverty that were segregated now when they were not before. Then the politicians who spent their entire careers demonizing the people corralled and trapped into them. That's a part of this legacy. The history of the government using highway construction to destroy Black neighborhoods full of hardworking, home-owning residents and thriving businesses. That is a part of this legacy. Black people couldn't even enjoy the storied delights on Route 66, where the song memorializes the idea that people can get their kicks on that route. But Black people never could. Since out of the 8 states that Route 66 ran through, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, 6 had official segregation laws as far west as Arizona, and all had unofficial rules about race, as many towns along the route were sundown towns. I know, at this point, many people are thinking, oh my God, that is all very awful, but what does that have to do with these protests and the property damage being committed now? Well, let's just look at the history of protecting property in Wisconsin. Over 200 consecutive days, civil rights activists marched for housing desegregation and were met with a regular mob of up to 8,000 angry white residents intent on blocking integration of their neighborhoods. This was in August 1967. And in Kenosha specifically, while many Blacks fleeing slavery found jobs, they also found the housing discrimination that we talked about earlier that laid the groundwork for the persistent economic and racial disparities that led to the current protests. So what's happening in Kenosha in regard to these protests, as well as in Minneapolis and in so many other cities across the country, is the result of people rising up against this entire history of the racist assault on Black, but also Chicano and other marginalized people's lives, with police terrorism often used to carry out the racial balkanization of the communities and to surveil and control the marginalized populations to keep them in their place. The outpouring of protests are born out of not just the latest police shooting, but out of centuries of brutal systemic oppression, dispossession, and disenfranchisement that has gone completely unacknowledged and entirely unaddressed. And when someone in a protest these days starts a fire or breaks a window, most of the time that completely random act is one of misery and rage at having to endure this continued dehumanization in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 2000s, in 2020. The anger only grows among those of us who live this legacy of this history every day in our segregated and underserved and under siege communities. When, yes, we have to clean up the broken windows and rebuild a burned building, but we also hear politicians talking mostly about punishing rioters and looters, but not saying much about the long campaign of rioting and looting of our lives, of our opportunities, of our property, and our rights that have been committed against us. I cannot state this strongly enough. that out of all of the acts of bodily violence and property damage committed against just Black communities throughout history that I gave just a fraction of in this segment, there has been no compensation for any of that damage done. But the Small Business Administration has offered low-interest loans to help business owners recover from the recent unrest. A 105-year-old survivor of the Tulsa massacre, one of the very few remaining alive, has actually filed a lawsuit for reparations from the destruction she and her family suffered in the 1921 White Riot. Aside from $130,000 that was raised by the Red Cross for the survivors at the time, other efforts at justice and full restitution for the victims of the Tulsa massacre have all failed. Add to all of this history the fetid mix of this history, the groups of armed white militia who, as I said at the beginning of this segment, believe is their near sacred duty to protect property, who show up not just to shoot people they believe are vandals destroying the all precious property, but some of whom have actually been proven to be the instigators of some of the very vandalism and property damage that many of them claim they are there to protect. Literally creating the conditions that they say warrant their presence in many protests that have been largely uneventful outside of the constant assaults on protesters by the police. This is how a society that was established and grew on the premises of gross racial injustice can so easily dismiss the continued struggle for racial justice by focusing on the destruction of property rather than addressing the repeated destruction of the bodies, lives, and rights of the people they condemn. This is how people can easily say that riots will lessen the moral standing of the protests, because the system that is without morals has determined that a burned building today is more important than entire communities burned after year, century after century, with no recompense for the survivors, their offspring, and the generational trauma we endure. This is why this same focus on property damage was used against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights marches he led, which caused him to be reviled during that period of time, even though many people today claim that they have the utmost respect for him and often use his words against protesters. And the easy dismissal of the demands for justice then are why people are back in these streets now. I am not going to condemn property damage, not because I support it or because I find it has a purpose. No, I'm not going to condemn property damage because it is simply not the issue that needs to be discussed. What I will say is that for peace to be realized in this society that was built on so much injustice, it is that injustice which must be addressed. Justice must be addressed. You heal injustice with justice, not with silencing and gaslighting another generation crying out for that justice. We move on from here working to implement justice, or we end up right back here in another generation having the same conversation about property damage instead of about justice. I hope I have been able to help you understand why working toward justice is the only thing that we need to be focusing on right now for a better future, for a future of peace for all of us. This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network in the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C.